Hello my lovely nerds and welcome back. I hope you're ready for this because we're going in deep this time. If not, well, you have until the end of the intro video to get yourself prepared. Get ready. This week's topic was inspired by a really interesting panel I was invited onto earlier in the week at QuaranCon, which was discussing the subject of what fantasy gets away with that sci-fi doesn't. I'll put the link to the panel discussion in the video notes so you can watch it for yourself if you're interested, which I recommend you do. But why the spin-off? Well, as usually happens with any conversation that involves the words fantasy and sci-fi in the same sentence, it quickly descended into a discussion about the differences between the two. I've seen a few of these discussions over the years, mainly because there is a lot of grey area. Now, it probably won't surprise most of you that I'm interested in the subject considering the name of my channel and my background as both a scientist and a fantasy lover, but this subject particularly interests me because of the books that I write and the books that I encourage a lot of people who watch my channel to write. But more on that later. To begin, let's discuss the subject of spectrums. When it comes to storytelling, there are lots of different spectrums that books end up on. A good example of this is the character versus plot spectrum. Now, the two aren't mutually exclusive, but at one end are your plot-based stories. Detective novels tend to fall into this category, although not exclusively. And on the opposite end of the spectrum are your more character-based stories. A film I watched about Princess Diana the other night fell pretty heavily into that character-based side of it. There was barely any plot at all. Still a great film. Between these two ends of the spectrum are the stories where characters drive plot and plot drive character. And most books skew towards the centre of the spectrum, as they do on most bell-shaped curves. To make it extra complicated, at any one point in the story, your book is probably at a different point of the spectrum, but as a rule, once you've finished and had time to think about it, you can probably put most books somewhere on this spectrum. And science fiction and fantasy is no different. But the spectrum is a lot less easily defined, and that's what's causing the debate. Before I get more into this, and I shouldn't need to say this, but I have to because I've had people come at me about this before, but I know a lot of people have entwined their identity with the type of books that they enjoy. I've seen a lot of science fiction and fantasy readers get very upset at any attempt to redefine their genre. And let me be clear here, I am not passing any judgment on the quality of a book by what I'm saying here today. Frankly, I don't really believe in calling one book better than another. To do so pits books against each other, but it's often apple versus pears. So, to be extra clear, don't come at me about this. All books are equal in my eyes. Anyway, enough caveats, let's get on with it. So far as genre goes, science fiction and fantasy are interconnected in about as many ways as they can be. But as a society, we tend to divide them. Mostly for the purpose of marketing, because categories make things easier to sell and easier for readers to associate their identity with. But while these broad categories work to an extent, there are lots of ways they don't. Let's start with the definitions. They vary a little depending where you look them up, but broadly, science fiction and fantasy are both speculative fiction, but science fiction tends to be about advances in science and technology, while fantasy involves magic. The problem is, though, that these aren't mutually exclusive, which leads to a huge grey area. There are already so many stories that don't fit the rule that a new subgenre has already emerged. Introducing science fantasy. FYI, that's how new genres normally arise. Enough stories break the rule and then a new genre gets created to fix the situation.
Hey guys, just jumping in right now because I was editing and I realised there was a point I really should have stressed here. When we're talking about the definitions of science fiction and fantasy, science fiction being about science and technology, magic being for fantasy, what we're really talking about is the possible or plausible and the impossible. So fantasy tends to represent the more implausible and impossible scale of the spectrum, while science fiction, and with its science and its technology, represents the possible or at least plausible end of the spectrum.
Now, science fantasy is a hybrid genre that combines the tropes of both science and fiction and fantasy. But while science fantasy is helpful, it's a bandage for a larger problem. It's too broad. There are lots of stories the label doesn't really work for, but then it's also a catch-all, and if something is catching all, then it isn't really defined, is it? It's why I suspect that more subgenres will emerge in time, or they'll either break away from science fantasy or it'll get divided up into multiple different things. But let's get ahead of the curve here. Let's break science fantasy down. To do this, we need to go back to the question of the difference between science fiction and fantasy. And we need to start with the core of the distinction between the two, which comes down to the spectrum they both lay on of magic versus technology. At the magic end of the spectrum, technology is basically non-existent. Magic is what makes everything possible. There's very few books that actually do this, but that's the end of the spectrum. At the other end, you have technology and science making things possible. In between the two lies a lot of confusion. You have stories based in technologically advanced worlds using magic, like Star Wars. You also have stories that use technologies that we think might be possible, but might not be. So maybe one day we'll have to redefine them as fantasy, like Star Trek.
As I was editing, I realised I missed out Arcane. How could I miss out Arcane? Arcane is a fantastic example of a series that is really blurring the lines right now, because Arcane has very scientific-based characters, and yet nobody is watching that thinking this is a science fiction. So you've got a story that is about the scientific use of magic. Where does that fall?
There are lots of factors making the spectrum very confusing. None the least is the fact that the basis for this spectrum is in a very fast state of flux. Our technological and scientific abilities of today aren't what they will be tomorrow, and they're not what they were yesterday. And this causes two main issues. Number one, there is always a point where the author has to accept the limitations of our real-world knowledge. Number two, science fictions become fantasies when we disprove their underlying technology. And the same is true in reverse for fantasy. Light speed space travel? We don't know if this is possible. Well, we think not, but we're holding out hope. But we class this as a science fiction device. If one day it is shown never, ever, ever is this possible, will stories using it be reclassified as fantasy? Now this is the problem when you're basing a genre off what is in a state of flux.
Maybe part of the problem here is that we are comparing science fiction and fantasy when actually we're forgetting that science fiction is forward-looking, right, from where we are right now. So the opposite of that isn't fantasy, it's history. And that's a really interesting one, because if you compare the two genres, then what we see is that our understanding of science fiction is changing as our advancement in technology is progressing. Likewise, if you flip it and you look backwards, our understanding of history changes the more we learn about history, as we get better records or whatever. I'm not a historian. But that was the really interesting concept, because it asked the question of, well, where does fantasy lie in this, right? Fantasy is not the opposite of science fiction. It is not the technological opposite. Fantasy is when we don't understand.
But I promised you another spectrum. So what is it? Well, interestingly, it's another one that sci-fi books have traditionally cornered the market on, but that fantasy is finally starting to catch up with. And that is the exploration of concept. At one end of the spectrum, you get the stories that have been written to explore a theme. You see this a lot in sci-fi short stories. Good examples of longer versions, Philip K. Dick's, anything by him, Ender's Game. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the stories that don't explore a theme or a concept. And again, no judgment here. I love a good bodice ripper Regency romance as much as the next person. Stories don't need to have a theme. So what happens when you map this out with our first spectrum? Well, in the top left corner, you can see that our technology-based explorations of themes are stories like Ender's Game and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And then below them, you have our more tech-based stories, but less thematic stories, like Guardians of the Galaxy and Iron Man. Hop across to the top right quadrant and you'll find another interesting area where fantasy is starting to corner the market that has traditionally been sci-fi. This is where magic is being used to explore theme rather than tech being used to explore theme. My own books fit into this category a lot of the time. Last Memoria explores how memories affect identity. Now this concept of memory loss and identity has been explored a lot in sci-fi, such as Blade Runner 2049, but it's not really been explored in fantasy, which is a shame because exploring the same thing in a sci-fi setting instead of a science fiction can be cool, and it can do a lot that sci-fi can't. Now, my books are about as un-sci-fi as you can get, but I still have readers saying how weirdly sci-fi they are once they've read them. Not in a technology or in a setting way, but in terms of the exploration of a concept. Any genre can explore concept. That's why it's not something that is limited to the sci-fi books that we have. It's just that sci-fi has tended to do it more, which is why it's so exciting to see fantasy authors emerging, exploring concept in a fantasy setting. Now, this video has gone on for more than long enough already, but before I sign off, I have a couple of points to make on why any of this matters. First off, the system we have is ineffective. It's causing continuous debate, and it's preventing readers from accessing the stories they like. If you're the type of reader who loves thematic fantasies, then you're going to have to read your way through a lot of other books before you find one. And it's even worse if you're the writer of those books because your readers aren't finding you. That is heartbreaking. You know they're out there, you're just struggling to find them. But there is another bigger reason why this is important, and that's that genre isn't a monolith. The science fiction fantasy community is hugely diverse. And on the one hand, it's great that we all have this connection, but on the other, these are very different subgenres that we are smooshing together as one. And if the direction society is going in has taught us anything, then it's that nobody likes to be boxed in a category they don't fit in. By better defining the genre system, we can create more room for books to exist, rather than tearing down books that were never made to compete by the categories that we force them into. Alright, my nerds, in case any of you are still with me after all of that, thank you for listening. I hope you have a great week, and please do let me know your thoughts in the chat. I'm sure there's a lot about this topic that I've missed, got wrong, missed out the nuance on, anything. I'm always happy to revise and improve my thinking, so speak up, let me know. Bye, my nerds!